how you get there. Inject a little gas and it goes real fast, but wouldn't it be fun if it ran on sunshine? Cars run on air. I'd tell you all about it if I thought you'd care. How compressors waste all their heat, and that's what's really neat. So what do we have to thank for all the air that's in the tank? That's a lot of energy for all the world not to see. Cars run on air. I'd tell you all about it if I thought you'd care. How? Cars run on air. I'd tell you all about it if I thought you'd care. How the Earth's atmosphere is a giant tank of air, sucked up by gravity so you and I can breathe and even rear back and shout without bouncing out. Oh, cars run on air. I'd tell you all about it if I thought you'd care. How to move some air aside in the tank, suck it up with the air that's inside in the tank. For free, it's compressed, it's a piggyback guest. The tank was already full, you never stop for combustible fuel. Oh, cars run on air. I'd tell you all about it if I thought you'd care. How? I'd tell you all about it if I thought you'd care. How air motors run on heat, exhausting snow all over the street. The air in your lungs will always be free, heated by the sun and compressed by gravity. Oh, cars run on air. I'd tell you all about it if I thought you'd care.
Okay, they're getting close now. Okay, time to fade out. Fade out now. Amazing, that invention, the volume knob. It's like you can just move that thing and fade right out. Speaking of fading out, this here's Professor U.D. Guru, and I'm coming to you directly from Air Car University in southern Mindanao. I was going to do this lecture posthumously, but somebody informed me that in order to do that, I would have to die first, and I'm not ready to die. So I'm going to go ahead and dip into the past and tell you what I did with my third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, and ninth childhoods, because I feel like it was a fairly unique contribution and somebody should talk about it, but I was the only one that was there, so I'm going to be the one to have to tell you all about it. I was Mr. Air Car, whatever you want to call me. I didn't have an official name. It ended up turning into aircaraccess.com, Pneumatic Options Research Library, which you can still find on archive.org. Aircaraccess.com will reappear one of these days at limberluck.com, where I'm planning to put all the content from all my websites. All my websites are currently offline except treebard.com. At some point in the future, preferably before the posthumous period, posthumongous, I forgot the word already. So I got to get down to it and get it done before the, senility finishes setting in. And whatever it is that I was talking about, then you can go ahead and finish that sentence for me. My papa had a thing for player pianos. That's a piano that runs on air. It's an air-powered computer from the early 1900s. There would have been lots of player pianos going during my papa's childhood, because the record player was probably brand new about then. And when I was a kid, my papa worked out in the field, because he wasn't a farmer. He was a farmer's assistant in a way, but he worked for the government. He worked for the USDA. He helped the farmers plan soil conservation in their fields so that their stuff wouldn't wash away and blow away and stuff like that, because he grew up in the Dust Bowl, and he felt like it was a good idea not to have another Dust Bowl. So he worked for the conservation people. He was out in the field one day, and he found an old player piano in an abandoned shepherd's shack, and managed to contact the owner and buy the piano from them, and brought it home, give it to my mama. And my mama loved to play the piano. She taught me how to play, she taught me how to read music when I was 5. And I never took another piano lesson from her, but later on, after I got interested in ukulele and guitar, I still remembered what she had taught me about reading music at the age of 5, and then I was able to mess around with music a little bit myself off and on over the years. My mama used to play the piano for the church, organ, piano. She was also a church secretary. Me, I'm what you call a radical pseudo-Buddhist, which means that when I was forced to go to church as a child, I used to sit there and, write on the little piece of paper they give you when you walk in. It tells you what order they're going to sing the songs in. They call it the church bulletin. My mama used to make those on a mimeograph machine. Remember those? I had one once. I bought one at a thrift shop and took it home and tried to have some fun with it, but it wasn't very willing. After you've met a copy machine, you can never go back. Photocopy machine. My papa used to travel a lot. Sometimes he'd leave on Monday morning, come back on Friday afternoon. He traveled for his job, and so one time, since he was so keen on player pianos, my mama tried to fix our player piano. It didn't work, of course. It was all busted up inside. It wasn't busted up, and that was nice. It was just wore out, because they're made out of bellows and stuff, and the bellows cloth all had holes in it. So my mama tried to fix it. She did get it to run a little bit with a vacuum cleaner, but you couldn't hardly hear the music over the sound of the vacuum cleaner. Anyway, the whole idea of a player piano is sit down and pump it with your feet. That got me inspired. When I was about 13, I decided, oh, what the heck, I'm going to fix that player piano. I'm going to make it work right. And my papa took me to see a local fella named Monty McLean, and he sold us the parts. And we got a book in the library that said how to fix player pianos. And I did. I worked on it all summer, stayed up late every night watching old Woody Allen movies like What's Up, Tiger Lily? Remember that line? There's two Japanese spies looking at each other and peeking over the dike and spying on the other guys. One of them turns to the other one and says, I gotta pee. Of course, that's Woody Allen's version. He put new words to it. Anyway, I always remember that when I think about my first player piano rebuilding job. When I was done fixing up the player piano, I put a roll on it. It was all put back together and It's time for the big test. I spent my whole summer doing it. My mama sat down next to me on the piano bench. I started pumping, fire up that first piano roll. It was, if I am not at the roll call after the battle is done, won't you? I don't remember the song. Anyways, yeah, the darn thing wouldn't run. I just the the roll turned, but not one note came out of that piano. I was sitting there. Oh, my mama said, "Oh," and I took my fist and I smacked that piano and I started playing. Played great for years. I swear to God, this is a true story. Too bad that didn't work on subsequent player piano rebuilds because I did rebuild maybe a dozen or 2 dozen player pianos, and a good healthy majority of them didn't work that great when I was done. I ended up getting a job from the Monty McLean's assistant. Monty, he moved to Oregon because I don't know, he had emphysema, I guess. He used to rebuild player pianos for all the Shakey's pizza parlors all over the country. They send him an old piano, he'd fix it up and put all this neon tape on it, put a plexiglass front on it, put a coin-operated box on it, and vacuum motor and stuff. And he fixed all those broken old player pianos for the Shakey's Pizza parlors. Remember Shakey's Pizza? Yeah, back when it was like, it's still okay. I mean, the one I go to in the Philippines is better than some anyway. But they don't have player pianos anymore because they all ran out of player pianos. You rebuild it and it needs to be rebuilt again in 10 or 20, 30 years, and you can't really do that. You can't keep doing it because it keeps chipping away and wearing away, and the wood turns into dust and stuff like that. But for a while, when I was a kid, player pianos were enjoying a resurgence of popularity due to the fact that so many of them were still around, and some of them were in good enough shape to where you could rebuild them. But there was this air motor. It's made with bellows, and it had a crankshaft and had valves on it that would turn the paper roll, which was the computer code that told the piano what notes to play. I was fairly impressed with this air motor, and I decided, well, what the heck? I can make me a car that runs on a big bellows motor. It's like 6 feet tall. You just bolt it to the floor and you get a piece of plywood and you make an air motor, put some wheels on it, put a chain, and turn the wheels with this air motor, oversized version, of course. I was working in a pipe organ factory when I came up with this idea. I drew a nice picture of it and I showed it to Doug. Now, Doug, he looked at it over at the Red Lion. He took me to the Red Lion. That was in Lawrence, Kansas. A special place because it includes a university on top of a hill, and any town that has a university up on top of a hill is a pretty good place, especially if there's ivy and stuff growing all over the walls, and they have a awesome library with dozens of old compressed air textbooks in the basement. I really liked that place. But player pianos didn't run on compressed air, they run on suction. So I wanted to have a pedal mechanism like a bicycle or something, or a bellows or whatever. You sit on your air car and pedal it, and then when you're going downhill, you conserve some energy for going back uphill. Well, I showed Doug. His name's Doug Dubois. He's sort of like the mayor of Lawrence now, I think. He become an engineer or something. I think he designed some airplanes. I don't remember. Anyways, Doug took me to the Red Lion, and we went in. He said, you got to do what I tell you. You go in here, there's rules. Okay, there was a little chipped, broken old ceramic, tiny Red Lion sitting in the window. And other than that, there's no sign, and the window is covered with red velvet curtains. And this little old ceramic red colored lion had obviously come from, somebody's grandmother's attic or a thrift shop of some kind. And that's all the indication that this was a place called the Red Lion. And Doug said, you follow the rules or we'll get thrown out, because he just throw out anybody who doesn't follow the rules. So from that point, I did what I was told. And here's what happened. At a certain exact time, the people who were outside waiting, only men. They're all young, so it so happened they were all young because it's a college thing, you know. Here's a college thing. You're gonna go in here as a college thing, so you can say you did it later on. We had a college there in Lawrence, did I tell you? At a certain exact time, the door was open, and we were allowed to go in quietly and sit down, and we could talk to each other at our tables quietly. There's only like 10 tables. There's a sign on the inside of the front door that said, "Don't tell your friends. Remember, it's your seat." Okay, there's rules in this place. The red line, I'll never forget the red line. And then at a certain point, the owner, I forget his name, he's an older fellow with crew cut, and I think he had a gold tooth or silver tooth or something like a pirate. He come out and rubbing his big old knives together. And at that point, everybody stands up quietly and goes and lines up quietly. And it's a cafeteria style, but you don't take what you want. He serves it to you. And when it's your turn, you get up there and he says, "How you doing, darling?" And then when the next guy gets up there, he says, "How you doing, dear?" It's alternate, darling, dear, darling, dear. It's all men, but that's what he says. And what you have to say, if he doesn't recognize you, you have to say, "I'll have the usual bill." I guess his name was Bill. "I'll have the usual bill." Or no, "I'll have the special." Yeah, "I'll have the special bill." That's what it was. That's what you have to say. If you don't say it right, you're going to leave. And then if he does know you, he may or may not say to you, "You real hungry today?" And you say, "Yes, Bill." And he gives you a little extra something. And then you'll go sit down and eat quietly. You can converse quietly. And he walks around and talks to some of the regulars a little bit. His daughter or whoever it was is working there comes around and gets your drink orders. When you're done, you leave. That is the Red Lion experience. I thought you'd want to know about that. Of course, we were working at a pipe organ factory at that time, and pipe organs also run on suction. And a pipe organ, that's big enough to live in. I used to want to write a movie script about a homeless guy who actually lives inside a pipe organ. And maybe I still will if I live long enough. Who knows? Of course, my friend Doug, who is, he's near engineer, and later on he did quite a bit of engineering. He said, "Well, that's an interesting picture you have there." He was nice to me. But I was in my first year of air car research. It was 1979, and by the time I had been into air car research for a year, thinking that I had invented air cars and that they were going to run on big old wooden suction motors with bellows for pistons. I was living in Portland, Oregon. This was back when Portland, Oregon was a fairly civilized place. And I was working in a bindery. I was working in the county library's book bindery. And I learned a little bit about compressed air in that place too, because there's this air-powered book clamp. You'd put a book in this clamp and press then you'd step on the handle thing with your foot and mash the book in the clamp along with your hand. And that's one of the things I learned about compressed air early on, is you don't want to have your hand in the clamp with the book when you step on that switch or whatever it is that uses compressed air to slam those jaws shut. I didn't tell my boss that I did that because I found it an embarrassing mistake to make, and my hand did hurt for a couple of weeks after that. Lots of that stuff in there worked on compressed air. In fact, my very first job, I was working in my first full-time job, I was working for Emery Dahl down at Dahl Irrigation in Salina, Kansas, and I was listening to the old farts. There's two old farts, one real old, one medium old, that worked in the shop there, and they was talking about compressed air, and they were talking about how compressed air was dangerous because if you had a bolt in your hand and you squirted that bolt with compressed air, it could take off out of your hand at ballistic velocity, go right in somebody's eye. So I never forgot that either. But at my job as a book mender, and the boss was, teaching me a little bookbinding on the side, hand binding of fine old books with leather backs and stuff because I had taught myself bookbinding at the age of 11. So I was a fan of bookbinding. It was one of my hobbies. And so he was taking me aside and teaching me stuff. But for the most part, I spent most of my time sitting at a table. And Rose was over there, and Esther was over there on my left. And then over on my right was Maria Heaton. She's quite an interesting person, and she always sounded really intelligent when she spoke, and she liked to read. She read a lot. She read books that I recommended. She was a speed reader. She could read lots of books. So she read books that I recommended, which, most people won't do that. So she made an impression on me. I kind of liked her. But she's very serious in some ways. She eventually got tired of me repeating myself because I was talking about air cars constantly, and I was the inventor of air cars, blah, 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 blah. Little did I know that there in St. John's area of Portland, there had been a real air car inventor, a compressed air car inventor at one time. I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but there were dozens and dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of air car inventors, and there still are air car inventors. You just don't hear about them very much. But it was almost coming up on Halloween, about 1980, and Maria piped up one day and she said, "Well, my husband wants me to invite you to Halloween dinner." She gave a spaghetti dinner every Halloween, spaghetti dinner that couldn't be beat. And I was to be invited so that her husband, George Heaton, could tell me about his real air car that he actually built when he was very young, my age, in fact, when he was like 24, 25. And by now he was in his 50s. He was a taxi driver. He drove the longest Cadillac in the world as a taxi. And he used to give rides to the governor and the mayor, and he was, an acquaintance of the governor. And they called him because they liked him. They liked his car. He was a truly genteel gentleman. He could talk to anybody, and he would. If he saw a child walking down the street, he'd stop and talk to the child. He'd talk to anybody. And he was a very sociable person. Ladies' man, he had several, families in his past. And because he's such a friendly person, I guess he said, well, invite that retard. Oh, I'm just joking. I'm not a retard. I was back then, but I'm not anymore. He said, invite that young feller who's always talking about his non-existent air car to spaghetti dinner on Halloween, and I'll tell him about my real air car. So I showed up in my costume, my average boy costume. I was a Devo fan in those days, so I had me an average boy costume, and I had a mask made out of bread dough, but I took it off for the picture. It weighed about 10 pounds, too, because I didn't let the bread rise, before I baked it. Yeah, it was a average boy mask made out of bread dough. Did I tell you that already? That's Rose in the picture, Rose. She was one of the book menders also. So we had our spaghetti dinner. It was good. We were sitting around later, and Maria had informed me, don't push, don't ask a bunch of questions, don't be pushy. Just wait till he's ready, and when he's ready, he'll tell you all about his air car. So I didn't say nothing. I just sat there patiently and watched him. He had a friend there that he was talking to his friend, and then after a while, he looked at me and said, okay, well, let's go in the other room. I'll tell you some stuff. So he took me in this dining room that was lined with books and closed the door, and we sat down at this big empty table, and he started telling me all about what he did when he was a young man. He just got thrown out of the Navy for defending a girl. Unfortunately, he defended a girl against his superior officer. He ended up getting thrown out. So I don't know if he won the fight, but he did get thrown out of the Navy for what he tried to do. I learned all this later. I did so much research on so many inventors. I'm going to make a website about it called Air Car Hall of Fame. I've got it partly done, but it's an old topic by now, and I actually have to force myself to work on it because it was 1979, this is 2025, so hopefully I'll live long enough to get motivated again so I can finish the Air Car Hall of Fame. But he and a friend, who he did not name, And I'm sure that his friend knew more about mechanics and compressed air than he did, but who knows? They built air cars. They turned regular old car engines into compressed air engines. They took off the carburetor and they bolted a brass plate over the hole, and they put air in from a tank into the spark plug holes, and they changed the camshaft so it ran power stroke on every other stroke instead of every fourth stroke. And they had cars that they started out with motorcycles, but the motorcycles they just drove from one gas station to the next and filled the tanks with the tire nozzle. But their air cars, they drove from coast to coast back and forth the United States. They had a few of them. They kept blowing up engines. That's the reason he gave why they quit, because they were not engineers enough, that's his words, to know what pressures to use. I'm guessing they also didn't know what oil to use, because if you use an automotive oil, it's going to get all sludgy because compressed air gets cold when it expands in an engine. Maybe they didn't even know that. I don't know. But he said last time he's driving his air car across the Nevada desert, a piston blew out of the top of the engine through the hood into the sky, and he never saw it again. That was the end of their career as air car inventors. What really got my goat, and it took me a long time to actually take an interest in this part because it was a little hard to believe, is he said these cars worked like perpetual motion machines. He did not believe in perpetual motion. Most of these inventors did not believe in perpetual motion. There is no such thing as perpetual motion, and what we're talking about here is solar energy. But he said that you could run them out of air if you weren't careful, but if you knew what you were doing, you could drive these cars from coast to coast and never have to stop for air because the air was going into the tank in some special way, in little spurts, pulses, pop, 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 like that, instead of in a steady stream. And there was something he said about the air went in at an angle or something. Those are his words, and that's about all I could tell you, because that's about all he could tell me. He had done this. It had been such a long time previous, 30 years, because he was doing this in 1949 and we were talking in 1979. Eventually, even though I obviously did not believe in perpetual motion, his words got the better of me because he was such a kind and nice and very popular person that I couldn't believe that he was just making this up just to have some fun with me. So I started researching it and blah, blah, blah. Long story short, shorter than it should be really, because it's a very long story. I ended up researching air cars for 20, 30, 40 years, depending on how you count. I mean, obviously I took many breaks. I didn't do it constantly, but I did spend a lot of time and money in libraries photocopying old compressed air textbooks. I learned that there had been compressed air locomotives in industry for street transit in New York and Paris and Bern, Switzerland, all over the place. Coal mines especially were a great place for compressed air locomotives because coal mines have this flammable gas in them, and compressed air engines are very safe. There's no spark, no heat. And at some point around 1908, 1907, they started absorbing heat from the air around the engine in the mine to expand the supply of compressed air in the tank. Of course, you're using air out of the tank, so the tank's getting cold. You expand the air once, push a piston, you put it in a heat exchanger, and it draws heat right from the atmosphere, which expands your air supply so you can expand the same air again in a different piston. And actually this did improve the range of the air-powered locomotives by like up to 10%. And then they took this same idea to Europe, where they expanded the air 3 times in a row in 3 different pistons with 2 heat exchangers. They were using these all over Europe in coal mines, Canada. And this model, at certain peak conditions, certain prime conditions, would expand the range of the vehicle between fill-ups even more. I don't remember the number, 20%, 30%. I think 30% was, but that was like the maximum, obviously, when it's running at peak conditions. And I talked to somebody from Europe who did the research there and he said they were actually fixing to go back to two-stage because too much trouble, too heavy, too big, too much expense. And it only worked really great at certain running conditions anyway. But at this point, I realized that George Heaton wasn't just making stuff up, because if he had a car running on compressed air, it was running on solar energy. If he could run it from coast to coast, I mean, a tank of air is only going to take a car a few miles at most. If it's really efficient and small and slow, and you're not driving it fast, maybe 50 miles maximum, more like 30, 20 miles. The average inventor, if they built a compressed air car, they'd probably drive it around the block and have to refill it. You got to really use the air very efficiently, and you got to study, and invent something really good if you want it to go more than just down the street. As fate would have it, I was hitchhiking. I got sick in a November rainstorm and went to my friend's house. Her name was Cheryl, there in Lawrence, Kansas. And she wasn't home, so I just went in. This is back in the olden days. You didn't have to lock your door in Lawrence, Kansas back in those days. 1980, 83, 85, I don't remember exactly. I'd been on air cars for a while, off and on. And when she got home, I said, hey, she didn't shoot me, fortunately. I was in her house by surprise. And she and her boyfriend let me stay there for 2 weeks while I was recuperating. And when I was almost well, I went to the library and did some research one day. And I come home and I said to Cheryl, hey, guess what? There's a guy named Terry Miller, and he's inventing air cars, real air cars. And he's showing his air car all over the country. And I said, and he's got a book for $5. And of course, I'd been hitchhiking. Did I mention that? And she said, okay, here's $5. You order that book. I want you to have that book. And then she said, and when are you moving out? True story. So thanks to Cheryl, I got Terry Miller's book. Great book. And it's 50 pages, and he explains stuff in his own way, which takes a while to figure out what he's talking about. But I learned from that book a lot of the things that I needed to know in order to carry out my research in coming years. And Terry Miller's specialty was not a car that would go from coast to coast. I think his car went 50 miles between fill-ups, and it was a small, lightweight car, and it didn't go very fast. Fastest it ever went was 42 miles per hour. His specialty was efficiency, using the air over and over. His real specialty was putting the backyard mechanic back in the backyard. Okay? He bought his parts and bolted them together. He welded up a little framework, bolted everything to a framework, made his own gears with a saber saw, whatever they call them, cutting the big old disc into a gear, and he drove his air car from coast to coast and was in dozens and dozens of newspapers, was in People magazine. That's where I first saw him. And the best part is, he lived in Kansas like me. So later on, that would be 1984, 1985, I actually went to his house and met him and saw his air car. And then I went home, and one day he called me up and said, hey, I need your help at the Energy Exposition in Topeka. So I went down to Topeka and helped him, and we went to the hotel and picked up Amory Lovins. He's a Rocky Mountain Institute. Yeah, it's all about energy and stuff. We picked him up at his hotel in an air car and took him he was the keynote speaker, took him to the expo center. So for 2 days, I got to drive Terry Miller's air car around in circles, and it was the best day of my life. Not many days have beat that day. So Terry Miller really, really helped me out in many ways. And just to meet somebody with his personality was a really great thing. One time I was driving people around, there was a little old electric car sitting next to our stall, and his just looked like a jalopy. It was a bunch of bolted together stuff. It looked like something somebody made in their garage, and that's exactly what it was. And there was a shiny little electric car next door, a very pretty little electric car next door. Nice, made in the factory and all that. And nobody cared to take a ride in it. Nobody wanted to ride in that thing. But there's people lined up to ride in the Air Car constantly. There was always someone standing in line to ride in that Air Car. So I had the time of my life driving the Air Car around in circles 4 miles per hour inside this building for 2 days. The best thing that ever happened to me. It broke one time while Terry was driving it, and we were looking at it and thinking, what's scratching our heads? It was time to quit for the day. So we went to the hotel, and then we were sleeping, and then the next morning I kind of woke up and Terry was snoring really loud in the next bed, and suddenly he went and he woke up and sat straight up in bed, and he said, "I know how to fix it." That's Terry Miller. He's intuitive. And he said, "The problem is the solution." And it was. I'm not going to tell you the details, but yeah, there was nothing to do except stop worrying, because the problem was the solution. Well, all we had to do was take it off the blocks, put it back on the ground, tighten one screw, and keep going, because when one thing broke, something else came into being. Another possibility came into being, and he suddenly realized that in his sleep. Okay, so I'm not that intuitive kind of person. One time I was driving his Air Car around in circles in this building, and he had gone off to get some popcorn. And I was driving the Air Car and 4 miles an hour, and he came up. I saw him walking towards me, and he was motioning at me to get off the Air Car while it was moving. Somehow I was able to read his mind. He motioned at me to get off the Air Car. I had a passenger, so it's only 4 miles an hour. I jumped off, and he jumped on. And instead of sitting down with his popcorn, he stood up, holding on to the tiller, because it had a tiller, not a steering wheel, holding on to the tiller, driving erratically, not dangerous, but, he wasn't going to knock anybody off. He knew what he was doing, but nobody knew who he was, because he had been off getting popcorn, and nobody knew who he was. Everybody thought he was some drunk, and he said, "Is this an Air Car? Oh, I'm riding an Air Car." It was funny, it was this very spontaneous kind of guy. And then many years later, in the 1990s, he invented a car. He lived in Joplin, Missouri, and I've learned that Joplin was a hot spot for air cars. There's been several air car projects come out of Joplin, Missouri, air engines, air cars. He's just the most recent, and actually there's some other people in Joplin built cars, air cars too. Here's a video clip for one of those, based on his ideas, and they shared ideas back and forth. Terry Miller learned from them, they learned from Terry Miller. During this period of time, we talked on the phone, and he promised to send me a videotape. Remember VCRs? VHS tape? He sent me a VHS tape of footage of his new air cars, which he called the Spirit of Joplin, because, that's what pneumatic means spirit or air. In Greek, that's pneuma, spirit, air, same word. But anyhow, he told me, call me sometime, call me when you get the tape, watch it, and call me. And he said, call me at 3 o'clock in the morning, because I'm diabetic and I have to get up and pee in the middle of the night. So I thought, well, no one has ever asked me to call them at 3 o'clock in the morning before, and I didn't really want to, but I forced myself to get up out of bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I called Terry Miller.
I'm Terry Miller. We're here in Joplin, Missouri, and we have a club here called the International Pneumatic Urban Commuter Club. Here we go. This engine uses the air twice, and then it goes over to the other engine and uses it twice again. So we have an 8-cylinder engine two engines together make an 8-cylinder engine, and we're reusing the air 8 times. Go from one cylinder to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And it's the sequential reuse of air which gives us the economy. It gets us down into the pennies a mile bit. If you only use air one time, pneumatics is using air in pneumatics is like for an air drill or a rivet gun or a jackhammer. One-time air use is still cheap, but it's not cheap enough for motive transportation. But if you can get air, we squeeze every last bit of energy out of that air. We just like wringing out a wash rag. And then we don't hurt the air. We give it back to Mother Nature.
His wife picked up the phone and said, "What? Who's calling it?" I told her, "Well, this is Scott Robertson. It used to be my name before I forgot what it was." And she, I guess they were laying in their bed or whatever. I could hear her turn over in bed and say, "It's Scott Robertson." And he said, "Oh, Scott Robertson." Oh boy, the tone in his voice. That just made my day. After that, I was always glad I called him, because I'll never forget that hearing in his voice that he was actually happy to hear from me, because, he had talked to thousands and thousands of people about air cars. And he told me most of them are wasting his time, and he was actually tired of it, which I couldn't believe at that time. But by now, I know what he was talking about. I don't do air cars anymore. Some people are. Some people still are. Some people who started out with me and then took off on their own. But I don't do it anymore. I have to force myself to even think about it. So I'm trying to get this all down for posteriority, in case I ever die, which I have no intention of doing, but I suppose it's possible, they say. Well, I once asked a Ouija board, me and my friend Joy Broth, I asked a Ouija board, in what year will I discover the secret of the free-range air car? I used to say self-fueling air car, but fuel is combustible, so I changed that to free-range air car. I said, "Ouija board, what year will I discover the secret?" Because at that point, I still didn't know it was ambient heat. Air engines run on the heat that's in the air. The pressure just allows the air to expand behind a piston, but the pressure is not energy. Pressure is just like the ability to do work. Potential energy, you can call it, but when it does work, it's not pressure. When it does work, it's heat turning into lack of heat. Heat turns into work. Ouija board said 1988. It didn't even blink an eye. It said 1988.
Goes out to the one I love. This one goes out to the one I've left behind.
That's the answer. Each reservoir I'll fill with an Underdog Super Energy Pill. There's no need to fear. Underdog is here.
Okay, so here I am in Grass Valley, California. By the way, they had an air-powered locomotive right there in Grass Valley, California at the famous Empire Gold Mine, which is a museum now. I got a picture of myself sitting on that locomotive. That was a pretty big deal for me to find that. But in 1988, a friend of mine named David London called me, and David's name had been given to me by Terry Miller, actually. Terry Miller said, "Well, here's a guy's name and phone number. He's a researcher. He researches air cars." So I had talked to David on the phone a couple times, and back in 1985 or 1984, he sent me a stack of newspaper articles in a big envelope, and these were my first exposure to all these air car inventors like Bill Truett and You know, up until that point, I thought, first I thought I invented the air car, and then I thought George Heaton was the only one, and then Terry Miller, and then David London sent me a whole bunch of articles about all these air car inventors. And a lot of them were saying, yeah, you could drive unlimited range, free range air car, which is, you know, that's against the laws of physics, right? Well, it's not, because it's not perpetual motion, it's solar. And then David London called me one day in Grass Valley, California, and he said, I want to have a three-way conversation with you, me, and this old feller named Mac, A.J. McDonald. Albert, I forget his full name, A.J. Sidney, Albert Joseph Sidney McDonald, something like that. I did his genealogy once. Research in air car inventors turned me into a genealogist. Then I wrote tree bar genealogy software. It's a big mess, don't get me started telling you about my life. Well, I already started, didn't I? Well, you ain't going to stop me, so you might as well fast forward to the punchline. Just kidding. I want you to watch every frame of this exciting and interesting movie. I mean, if you can listen to that song for 4 minutes, you can listen to me for 40 minutes, right? I did it for 40 years. What the heck? Yeah, I literally don't even talk to myself about air cars anymore, and that's pretty... You do get what they call topic fatigue after a while. So we're having this three-way talk on the telephone, and turns out Mac lives in Lodi. As a matter of fact, he's stuck in Lodi again, you know, like the song goes, Creedence Clearwater Revival. Yeah, he was driving through Lodi one time, and his car broke down. And he stayed for 30 years. So here we are on the telephone, and he said, well, I knew a real air car inventor, air engine inventor, and he had a compressor that ran an air engine, and it made its own air, and it made extra air, and you could run shop equipment like a metal lathe on the extra air. Once again, solar, not perpetual motion. And he told me the inventor's name, and after we talked, David London and I found the patent. He sent me the patent number, and I sent for the patent, and it took like 6 weeks to arrive. It was the longest 6 weeks of my life, except for, you know, between November 5, 2024 and January 20, 2025. That was also a very long 6 weeks. One of the worst, maybe the worst ever, the longest. Anyway, change the subject quick. When it arrived, I forgot to mention earlier, George Heaton had also said, there's a way to put low pressure air into a high pressure tank. And that is the whole problem with running a car on compressed air. It's not about the energy. The energy isn't the problem. The energy's in the air. If you put enough atmosphere into a air tank that's already full, it will be compressed by the air that's in the tank. The problem is getting it into the tank is very expensive. Not very expensive, but it's going to take more energy than what you're going to get out of it using conventional equipment. Okay, so when George Heaton said you can put low pressure air into a high pressure tank, you do it in pulses or something, maybe he put it in an angle or whatever. That stuck with me. I remember his exact words. And here I am reading Bob Neal's patent number 2030759, February 14, 1936. That's, I guess, his Valentine's gift to the world. And guess what he's doing? He's putting low pressure air into a high pressure tank. Bingo. Okay, I'm hooked. From that point on, George Heaton and Bob Neal owned me. That was my life. Off and on. You know, we take breaks in life to, you know, get jobs, eat, fix cars, stuff like that. But that was 1988, as predicted by the Ouija board. A year later, I was no longer in the trailer where Mac used to visit me from time to time. I was living in my car and had no car insurance, and the California police stopped me and gave me a ticket for not having car insurance. and that was a $600 ticket. I pay it or I go to jail for 3 days, my choice. So I wrote a letter to Mac and I said, hey, he'd been giving me some money. He was making a lot of money at that time. He usually didn't have a lot of money, but he was selling what they call it, food grade hydrogen peroxide, because he was what they call a naturopathic physician. In other words, not a doctor, but a health food fanatic. And he was selling lots of mail order hydrogen peroxide food grade mail order. And so he's making a lot of money at that time. So every once in a while he handed me a $50 bill. I wrote him a letter and said, hey, guess what? I screwed up my life. I'm in my 17th childhood and I'm living in my car, blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, all right, you get your stuff packed up and I'll come get you. So one night he shows up with 2 old men and he's driving a big old sedan, old. All my stuff was in Chris Skidmore's basement. He's a musician that I lived with for a while, but after a while he said, well, when you moving out, that kind of thing. And so my stuff was still in his basement. Sometimes I was sneaking into one of his driveways because he had 2 driveways and park my car at night. Because, you don't want to park just anywhere. You might get harassed or something. So Mac loaded up his car with what I couldn't get into my Datsun, and we headed off for Lodi. And we got about halfway there. We're in Sacramento on the freeway, and I'm behind them. My car's full of stuff, his car's full of stuff, and he's got 2 old men in the front seat with him, Russ and Marvin. I was following along behind them. It was late at night, and I noticed there were sparks coming out of his tailpipe. So I was honking. And hey, there's sparks coming out of your tailpipe. So he pulls over, and we pull over, and sure enough, his engine is totally blown. So I'm feeling pretty guilty by now because he come to get me. He's going to find me a place to sleep on his couch in a house that's already got 3 old men living in it. Russ stayed with the car so they could come back and get Russ and the car later. There's no back seat in my Datsun. The car is full. It's a station wagon, and the back seat's laid down, and it's full of my stuff. So Max sitting next to me, sitting on the brake handle, the emergency brake handle, because these are bucket seats, and Marvin sitting in the passenger seat, and I drove the 3 of us to Lodi. And after that, Mac got his tow bar and went and got another of his cars. He had a big yard full of cars, which is what they call an eyesore back in the old days. This is not a rural address. I believe that the city of Lodi was very happy when Mac moved to Colorado a couple of years later. But the whole way from Sacramento to Lodi, which was fortunately only like 30 or 40 miles, Marvin is complaining. I don't remember. Maybe he was the one sitting on the emergency brake. I doubt it because he was 88 years old. Mac was only 76, so I don't remember who was sitting on the emergency brake between the seats, but whichever one it was, Marvin was complaining, and oh, I know you hold me in contempt. He had Alzheimer's pretty bad, and every time he started talking like that, this congenial and wonderful, sweet old man that I knew as Mac revealed his other personality, which is, shut the fuck up, Marvin! And this just went on for an hour. We finally got to Lodi, and I walked in that house. Oh boy, you never saw anything like it. This house was literally my brother's keeper style, loaded to the ceiling, piles on the left of you, piles on the right of you. There was a aisleway that you could walk through if you held your elbows in between the junk. Over there on the right-hand wall, there was a big old shelf made of boards and bricks where he had like 6 VCRs and TVs and stuff because he had this system for copying VHS tapes for his research. I mean, Mac turned out to be quite a handful. He was in charge. He cooked, he cleaned, he did everything. He took care of Marvin. He took care of Russ. Russ kind of took care of himself. He wasn't quite that old, but he had suffered a heart attack and was about to suffer another one. When Mac got frustrated, he's just a little guy. He's a little old man, 76, 75, 74, with a really big nose. A lifelong bachelor who had always lived with his mother. His mother was on the lecture circuit. She was into weird science and conspiracy theory. This is a long time ago before they invented the term conspiracy theory. She was one of those, and they were like, racism ran in their blood. Nothing you could do about that. We won't get into that. But when Mac got to a certain level of frustration, he started making up cuss words because he'd already used up all the good ones. He started making up his own, just like that movie, you know, the Christmas Story about where Darren McGavin or whatever the actor is goes in the basement trying to fix the heater and for the furnace and blah, 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 and making up his Mac really did this. This is a true story. He had one foul mouth on him. Let me tell you, it was a two-bedroom duplex, 2 small bedrooms, also packed to the ceiling. There was a little tiny table that he used to type on. He typed 2-finger typing, you know, he's on an old-fashioned typewriter. He's sending letters out to people, doing his research, calling people on the phone. This is all very old-fashioned, obviously. One day, I'd about had it. Mac had found me a job in a machine shop, working for this big, mean Texan, another foul-mouthed person. It was scary as heck because he was big, and he was the owner of this big machine shop. But yeah, I'm going to stop telling you my life story now, but I got to tell you one more piece of it. I about had it living in Mac's house, and he gave up his bed so I'd have a bed to sleep in. So I was going to get in my car and drive away and just disappear or something. I couldn't stand my job. I couldn't stand my boss. I couldn't stand living with these 3 old men. I mean, it was okay. It was okay, but I had no space. Didn't have any privacy. I didn't have anything that I wanted. I didn't want to socialize with old people, really. I was depressed. I wanted to get in my car and escape. And I had decided I was going to make good my escape. Mac, he slept on the couch next to the front door. So what I had to do was to get up very early, before Mac. Of course, he's an early riser because he's old, right? I had to get up before him, grab the few things that I had packed that I really needed because I couldn't take much stuff, obviously, or I'd wake him up. This is 1989. It was a long time ago. And I was going to sneak out the door and disappear. So I got the door halfway open. My arms are full of stuff because I can only make one trip through that door. I'm halfway out the door, and I hear behind me, wah, wah. I look behind me, and Mac's sitting there. He's putting his pants on over his, boxer shorts because he sleeps in his boxer shorts. He's putting his pants on, and he got his pants up to his ankles. And he forgot to put them on the rest of the way. He sat there on the couch for 30 minutes with his pants on around his ankles, talking at me, telling me, oh, I know I'm a racist. You probably don't like that. You're probably upset because I'm a racist and blah, 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 and you shouldn't just leave and go. You're going to be homeless, blah, 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 and I'll try to be nicer and I won't cuss so much and blah, blah. I'll try to be nicer to Marvin, blah, blah. And then he started praying for me, and then we got, by now, Marvin and Russ are awake, and they're all 3 sitting there praying. Well, I had no choice. I had to stay. At some point, I decided based on the fact that I needed to get out of Mac's house and not have this old man take care of me the rest of my life, I went to Stockton, which was the next town, a much bigger town. They had a community college there, and got a college catalog and got excited about going to school, which is something that I would do from time to time, which is how I ended up with a, you know, student loan for Biden to forgive. Or Biden took credit for it. I don't think he actually did it. He didn't invent that legislation. He just kind of tweaked it a little bit and then took credit for it. So by then my Datsun had give up the ghost, and Mac was letting me drive one of his old cars to class every day. And while I was in Stockton at the campus, I went to the student affairs office or whatever they call it, looking for, a job, because they'd help you find a job. And some people who had jobs to offer would go to that office and post their job offering there because they wanted a student to come work for them. And I ended up working for Bob Murray. I remember I went in there in my thrift store clothes and my do-it-yourself haircut and my old photocopied letters of reference from restaurants where I'd been a dishwasher. I did some piano tuning too, but off and on I did other things. I handed him my letters of reference, and he's like in his 70s, but highly energetic. I said, maybe you could give me a chance. And he surprised the heck out of me, hired me, and I ended up working for him for 7 years, which is, I still dream about Bob Murray and the Postal Center, because it was, he let me think I was the manager of the Postal Center for, I believe it was 6.5 years, 7 Christmases, something like that. You can tell I got off the topic of compressed air, so let's get back on the topic. It's getting too, let's just say I built lots of stuff. I did lots of experiments. It was all pretty stupid, but I learned a lot, and if I was going to do it with lots of money, I think I would be able to do a better job. But spending my little old salary on parts and going to the junkyards and guessing and doing this and that and not having any kind of engineering assistance, I did a lot. And my real contribution is not what I did in the workshop, even though I built a couple of air engines that did work. My contribution was all those photocopies. I used to hitchhike to San Francisco, go to the Berkeley Library, the San Francisco Library, spend my grocery money on photocopies. This is literally true. There's more to tell. This story is very long. The thing about compressed air is, as the song says, all compressor work becomes heat. It's not an accident. It's just the way it is. This is correct. And nobody knows it, but they used to know it. It used to be in the textbook. Now the textbook is all extremely abstract and full of really abstract engineering and calculus. In other words, it's not something that anybody uses. It's just something they assign to engineering students, assuming that there's an engineering class anywhere on Earth that actually teaches anything about compressed air. There might be, but I took a class in pneumatics and hydraulics once, and the teacher knew nothing about pneumatics and didn't attempt to teach us anything about pneumatics. It was all hydraulics. Well, our educational system has definitely gone downhill. I'd say California, the West Coast, probably about the worst of it, just guessing. Because of the fact that all compressors waste all their energy as heat, and at the same time, the air tank has pressure in it when you're done compressing air, and all the heat has gone out of the tank and it's returned to room temperature, and the gauge says there's pressure in the tank. Well, where does that energy come from? If everything the compressor did became heat and was wasted to the surroundings, then why is there pressure left in the tank? Well, the answer is ambient heat, because the ambient heat was already in the air. So after the tank pressure has been raised and all the heat is gone, all the temperature differential has returned to ambient temperature, the pressure that's left in the tank represents what had been in the air already as ambient heat. So all air motors run on solar energy. They don't know this, but go to the old textbooks. It's true. It's in detail. It's right there, especially in Simons and Redfield, who was on the staff at Compressed Air magazine. There's a good article by Redfield. They both say the same thing. It's true. There are several good sources for the fact that all compressor energy becomes heat. So, if you can put low pressure air into a high pressure tank cheaply without pushing against the resistance of the air in the tank, then that's how you go about putting low pressure air into a high pressure tank. I'm not going to get into the details at all. There's people still working on this. Injectors, doodads, gadgets, gizmos, what have you. Heat exchangers, putting the compressor inside of a tank so that the heat stays in the system. Regenerative process like regenerative braking, regenerative shock absorbers to heat the air in the tank. They even put little wind fans on some cars that turn a compressor. Look for pneumatic options at archive.org. That's my collection. I made dozens of books over the years and used to sell them at aircaraccess.com, which I still own, but I probably will never put that website back at that point because I have 4 websites. I don't want to pay for 4 websites. I'll probably put the content from all 4 of my websites at one website, which is limberluck.com, but right now there's nothing there. I own treebar.com, which is for genealogy software, and eventually I'm going to move that to everything's going to be at limberluck.com. That's my plan today, and it might change. Not so many years ago, it occurred to me that me trying to save the world with compressed air, because my idea wasn't so much mechanical as it was social or antisocial or whatever you want to call it. I was against the status quo notion of having gasoline engines dirtying up our air and using up all the petroleum and just all the nastiness that goes along with it, energy monopolies. My reason for doing this was that I wanted to stop the monopolies. I hate monopolies. I hate bullies. I've been bully bait my whole life, and I felt like the auto companies and the gas companies and the oil companies were bullies, and they needed to be put out of business. And that's what motivated me. Right now, I will say, like, a certain other person who says this, dig, baby, dig, because right now we do not want to have society-wide upheaval. We do not want to force people to do the so-called right thing. This so-called green revolution is a scam. It costs more and uses just as much oil to run electric cars. The only good thing about electric cars is they don't have emissions, but somewhere somebody is using coal or oil to generate electricity. The batteries are terrible. The batteries, where they go to die, they're expensive. The materials in the exotic batteries, they come out of mines. Who is working in those mines? Probably little children in Africa or something. I don't know the details, but it's not a pretty situation. Electric cars is not an alternative. There is no alternative to air cars. In fact, your car, your gasoline car, runs on air pressure. Your diesel engine car or truck runs on air pressure. They inject a little gas, as the song says, to make it go further between fill-ups, and that's the only reason. But this is a sick car. That's why it has a temperature. Most of that heat is wasted. It has to go to the atmosphere, or the car would melt. Like my first car, had it for 2 weeks and it melted. You know, the engine just kind of melted. I had all my stuff in it too. Yeah, that happened to me. It really did. First time I left home, all my stuff, heading off to piano tuning school. Hebron, Nebraska. Ooh, that's a cute little sound. Ooh, it's getting louder. Sold that car for $25, and my papa had to come get me. Well, life's short, life's long, life's short, life's long. Can't decide, you know. Now that I'm old and wise, I often think, you know, if I only had this much wisdom when I was young, I think I probably would have stayed home, got a job in a burger joint, maybe McDonald's or Hardee's is one of the places they have in Salina, Kansas. Or maybe the Pizza Hut. If I'd stayed home instead of going off to piano tuning school, rebuilding player pianos and getting sucked into the air car bottomless pit, I think I would own a chain of pizza restaurants by now. But it were not to be. So that's the short version. Thanks for showing up. This here's Professor UD Guru. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.